When I was in high school, probably about ninth or 10th grade, my best friend had a boyfriend that was older and lived fairly far away. So, he was not from our school or anything. Not sure how she met him. Anyway, when she would spend the night at my house or we would go to the mall or to go see a movie, he would often stalk us. We would be in my house and he would drive by slowly. And keep in mind, he lived nowhere near there, so it was a no accident. This was while they were dating. I think he wanted to check up on her to see if she was cheating on him or not. He would look to see if my car was at my house. One time, we were at an amusement park that was local, and he just happened to show up there. My friend, bless her heart, was kind of dumb and naive, so she honestly thought it was some random accident that he showed up at the amusement park while we were there. I obviously knew that it was intentional. It was pretty annoying that she and I could not do anything without him showing up or following us. I used to talk to him, and he told me that he wanted to poke holes in their condoms so he could get her pregnant, so that she would never leave him. I told her what he said, and she still continued to sleep with him. Finally, she got some sense and decided that she wanted to break up with him. Well, that did not go well. She had a grandmother that was elderly and was in early stages of dementia at the time. She lived alone, but only a few minutes from my friend so they could keep an eye on my grandmother and take care of her. Well, apparently, this crazy boyfriend started visiting the elderly grandmother pretty often on his own. No one knew he was doing this, since she was just a confused old woman. She was saying all kinds of things to her and trying to manipulate her. It worked to the point that the grandmother thought he was a great guy, and that my friend and her mom and stepdad were awful for treating him so badly. The grandmother had some kind of episode where she was yelling at my friend's parents about it and everything. It got to the point that they had to take out a restraining order on my friend and the grandmother, so he could no longer approach either of them. I'm not a scaredy cat, but I was getting a little nervous myself, because he did know where I lived, and he knew I was probably one of the ones encouraging her to break up with him. I worried that he might try to retaliate against me. But luckily for everyone involved, he took a hint and stayed away. But that is a truly shady tactic to manipulate an innocent old woman with dementia, and in turning on her own daughter and granddaughter, and confusing the poor old woman. Just a warning, everyone, this story has some controversial topics. Please read with care. So, to start at this story, I was best friends with a girl named Charlie for 3 years. I loved her and I thought that she loved me, but that wasn't true. 5th grade at primary school. Back in 5th grade, I had just been transferred to a new school. The whole class knew each other from the year before, and I was a complete outcast. I met Charlie at the school's open house, and apparently we sat at the same table. She was really nice and bubbly, and said that she would like to get to know me. I wanted a friend, and she was there. Sparing the details of awkward preteens trying to get through school, we became fast friends. We got each other's Skype and we talked day and night. We called nearly every day and would just talk for hours. She made me laugh and we could talk about anything. I also became friends with Charlie's friends, Catherine and Addison. We were a group of kids and we had fun. But things changed subtly over time. Charlie became more depressed, mentioning that she had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders. I did my best to comfort her. What are friends for? I assured her that this didn't change anything, and it's a good thing that she was getting help for the issues. She agreed, but I don't think she really believed it. I'm not entirely sure when it started, but Charlie started venting to me about her emotions. I would always listen and try to help when I could find the words. I was her shoulder to cry on, and I was happy that I could help her in some way. I felt like repaying her for picking up the new nobody who wandered into her friend group. She never got better though. She started to get more extreme and more serious breakdowns. She would call herself worthless, claiming that she could tell her parents hated her. I had met her parents by that point, and they were loving people. They clearly cared about her, and I told her so. She called me a liar, saying that I should just leave her to self-destruct and stop pretending that I care. I was heartbroken, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The next day at school, she seemed to be doing better, smiling and joking with her friends. I tried to ask her about the night before, but she got a very serious look on her face and she sounded angry, telling me that it doesn't matter anymore. I didn't pry, figuring that she would talk about it later. That night, I asked her again, but I got a similar answer from before. I was confused but just went with it. I wish I hadn't. It went for months like that. Her breaking down, spiraling, calling me a liar, a cheat, and saying that I hated her guts. Any attempt to comfort her or deny the accusations were met with liar. It became a routine. Charlie broke the routine by adding something new. She started to openly hurt herself in school. When she would mess up, answer a question wrong, or sometimes for no reason, she would take a mechanical pencil and start scratching her arm, holding it just to show me and her friends exactly what she was doing. Whenever we would try to stop her, she would snap at us, saying to stop pretending we care and to shut up or to don't touch me. We didn't know what to do. We were just kids. The summer after 5th grade went pretty well. We seemed to be getting a bit better, with less spiraling and breakdowns. We talked every day, and before we knew it, the summer was over. 6th grade, middle school. We were a year older and in a new school. We were still the group, me, Charlie, Catherine, and Addison. This is when Charlie got worse again. She started having breakdowns during school, and she would openly hurt herself more. I was constantly worried for her. I don't think there was a full day that whole year that I could relax and not worry about her hurting herself. If memory serves correctly, I have a lot of trouble remembering these years in detail. It was the year that she first messaged me saying that she wanted to really hurt herself. She explained how she would do it, and how easy it would be, and how no one would care that she was gone. I was crying hysterically, trying to calm her down and say how much I cared about her, and how I didn't know what I would do without her. She ended the conversation saying that she wouldn't do it. I was beyond relieved and made sure to check up with her the next day at school. She insisted that it wasn't that bad, and that I had overreacted. I still insisted that she be honest about those feelings and tell an adult if she was really thinking about that. Charlie promised that she would. The rest of the year remained pretty consistent, with a steady incline in severity of her breakdowns, but slow enough that I hardly noticed the change. 7th grade. This was the year everything really hit the fan. This year is very fuzzy in my memory, so I'll just have to hit the main points. Charlie was starting to struggle in school. When she was immediately graded something, she gave up. She would stop trying. The open self-harm got worse, going as far as to shout at me if I tried to stop her. But she was still my best friend. I loved her and she loved me, right? We could talk to each other about anything. Except when I tried to vent to her, she would say that I was making it all about me, or that she couldn't handle it right then. If she was having trouble and I tried to relate to her issues and give advice, she would say that I was making it about myself and that I'm not her parent. This year, I started to really question my gender. I met my actual best friend and my now platonic partner, Liz. We were two broken trans kids so deep in the closet that we couldn't admit that we were trans. Liz was the first to come out, and I welcomed her with open arms, gushing about how much stuff we could do together. Charlie didn't like Liz. She was clearly jealous and thought Liz was taking me from her. I reassured her that I still cared about her, and that she was still my number one, but she didn't believe me. About the middle of the school year, Charlie said that she might have a crush on me, and she asked if I would be opposed to being her romantic partner. At the time, I was very in denial about my sexuality, and said that I wouldn't mind it. She seemed to take this as me consenting to some kind of relationship. She became much more touchy, hugging me, and even kissed my head or forehead a few times. I didn't know why at the time. These actions made me incredibly uncomfortable, and I wanted to shrivel up and hide. I now know it's because I'm touch-averse, but at the time, I hated myself for these reactions. I beat myself up inside for recoiling from my best friend, and how dare I get grossed out. I very quickly fessed up to the discomfort, telling her that I didn't actually want to date her, that we weren't together, and that I wasn't comfortable with the amount of physical contact she was giving. She seemed understanding, apologizing for being touchy, and even joking a bit about being touch-starved. At that, she started to get really distant when we were in person, and not just physical distance. She seemed to avoid talking to me for long, and made any excuse to shut me off. The nightly routine of breakdown Russian roulette, or whether it be a couple sentences or 4 hours, continued. There were a few different times that she had threatened to really hurt herself, and more than once she said it would be my fault. One particular standout night, she sent me a video. There was Charlie sitting in her bathroom next to the toilet. It would be so easy for me to just end it. I could drown myself in the toilet and no one would know. It'd be quiet and no one would care. My parents don't give a crap. I texted her over and over again, begging for her to not do it, saying that I loved her parents loved her, and that I'd miss her. I cried so much that I got dehydrated. I stayed up past midnight just waiting for her to respond, but she didn't, and I thought that she was gone. I thought that she had really did it and it was my fault, that I should have gotten to her sooner. I cried myself to sleep that night. When I got to school, I saw her walking into class and my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. I ran up and I hugged her. I wept and begged for her to answer, asking where she had been, saying that I thought she was gone. She chuckled. Geez, sorry, I forgot to check my phone last night. I felt like everything stopped. I just stared at her. This person who I had loved for years now, who I looked after, talked to, cared for, and couldn't live without, just laughed about it. I didn't know what to say. I was so dumbfounded that I just tried to act normal. My whole view of her shattered that day, and it was the beginning of the end. That year droned on, and I slowly started to push away from Charlie. I still cared deeply for her, but I couldn't take it anymore. Her breakdowns and ramblings and venting was daily, and I just couldn't handle her berating me. I felt terrible, like I was abandoning her. It felt like leaving a person with a broken foot to walk 1,000 stairs themselves, but I had to get away. I started talking to our mutual friends about what she did and was doing. They said that it was terrible and couldn't believe she would say such things. I showed them the conversations, feeling even more guilty for showing off our private text to other people. I had to prove it though. I had to make them believe me. In the end, I did get away from Charlie. I think my other friends did too, but they didn't do much for me. They shut me out, and while I was broken, healing from a 3-year-long wound, they talked about me behind my back, added fuel to my fire, only to tell me that I only ever talk about Charlie. I lost about all my friends that year. I tried to resettle back into my group of friends at first, but it wasn't the same as before. I was constantly worried that they were talking about me behind my back, and I was terrified that they saw me to be on the same level as Charlie. And so I left that group. It was for the best in the end. It's been a few years now, and I can say with certainty that I have trauma from all those years. This post is by no means detailed enough to capture the horrific experience that was my time as Charlie's friend, but I don't want to reopen old wounds. I am still great friends with Liz, and she honestly saved me from Charlie's reign of terror. Her kindness and friendship contrasted with Charlie's everything woke me up to how awful it was. I don't hate Charlie, despite all that she did to me. She was a terrible person and an absolute monster of a human, but we were just kids. I know that I'm not the same person I was back then, and I figure that she isn't either. Everyone deserves a second chance in life, but Charlie, let's never meet again. Just an update to add a little more detail to the story. Charlie was on antidepressants starting in the summer post 5th grade. She often blamed her outbursts on her unfit medication, or stating that I forgot to take my meds. I later found out that she had been lying. Her parents ensured she took her medication at the right time each night, and her forgetting was a complete lie, used to excuse her actions. Later in the timeline of abuse, 7th grade, she would say things like, "Don't even try, she'll be back soon," referring to herself during a mental spiral or a breakdown as a different person. This is also when she started to claim to not remember doing the things she did during breakdowns. I know for a fact that she was lying about this, because in private, she would admit to remembering and say how she's not really two different people. Every time, it was just used as excuses for her to be a horrible person. More often than not, she told me it would be my fault if she really did it. If I left her, whatever she did to herself afterwards would be my fault. And if I stopped being her friend, it would prove her right. And so I stayed. Those few nights that she stopped talking abruptly, I was horrified that she did it, and it would be all my fault. I thought that her parents would get mad at me, screaming and crying at me for doing this to her daughter. But that day never came. I got out. I escaped her iron grip, and I have never been more thankful for having true friends who love me. I truly don't know where I would be now if I had stayed. During 8th grade, she was still in my school. We had the same math class each morning, and I did everything possible to ignore her. Sometimes I would see her in the hallway or at lunch, and I just couldn't bring myself to look at her. At one point, we were outside on break and she was right next to me, but I couldn't look at her face. I felt like if I were to look, my eyes would burn, like looking directly at the sun. It would be easy to hate her for everything she did to me and others, but hatred only breeds contempt. I do hope that she has found a better life, but I dearly hope for my sake that we never meet again. When I was 16 years old, I decided to surprise my parents with a bouquet of flowers for Valentine's Day. We've always celebrated this as a family holiday rather than a romantic one. I didn't have a car to drive to a florist, but my high school was within walking distance of a hospital, boasting a gift shop that sells floral arrangements. Between classes during the week of Valentine's Day, I set off for the hospital by my lonesome, cutting across campus to walk through a network of side roads, populated with specialty doctors' offices that keep odd hours, and the sort of buildings where traveling doctors mainly hold surgery consultations or perform small procedures a few times a month. The trip there passed without incident. As I was walking back through said deserted roads with a vase of flowers in tow, I noticed an unkempt 1990s car close behind me. While my memory of the car is hazy, I am left with the impression that there were at least two men within whose faces I could not see. Initially, I assumed that the driver was simply afraid of hitting me, the reason that they weren't passing by. So I made a point of dramatically trudging further into the grassy shoulder of the road, demonstrating to them that they could safely drive ahead. They still refused to pass me by, continuing to creep along behind at a slow pace. Beginning to suspect that the driver was more interested in me than a destination, I began to walk faster. The car confirmed my suspicions by matching my speed, despite the impracticality of my shoes and the threat of spilling water from my vase. I commenced to run as quickly as I could, but they hit the gas and they matched my speed. I realized at this point that the car was following me, that there was no place in sight to notice, and I needed to get away. I bolted into the first parking lot that I saw. The car turned in after me. And despite there being only 2 or 3 cars in the spacious front parking lot, and there being no other sign of activity at the office, this car did not stop to park in the numerous spaces available there. The driver instead opted to pursue me into this partially under construction back portion of the slot behind the office. It passed every available parking space to corner me against a pile of debris and rubble from the construction, coming to a diagonal stop less than 3 feet away. Before anyone could emerge from the vehicle, I somehow managed to scale the small prominence of rubble against my back, vase in hand, and I jumped from its peak to land painfully on the other side, which fortunately was a plot of undeveloped land with sight of my high school campus. I took a quick peek back over my shoulder to see if they were still in pursuit, but the car had sped off after I had reached the top of the rubble pile, and it was now nowhere in sight. They had not parked in the lot at all. They had no business there. The driver was following me. I sprinted at top speed, and didn't stop until I was soaked with sweat in the dead of winter, and panting in the student lounge among my classmates, who didn't seem to give a crap when I told them, possibly because our hometown is supposedly a trafficking capital, and the crime rate is outrageous. Although I am convinced that this was something more informal than trafficking, as the dilapidated car suggested poverty. And I've read trafficking usually arises through grooming and not being taken off the streets. In retrospect, I should have told an adult, alerted campus security, and called the non-emergency line of the local police station. But I was young, foolish, and insecure, and afraid of getting in trouble for leaving campus, when I didn't have a signed permission form permitting me to do so. I kept trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation, or that I was overreacting. I don't know what I would have even told the police had I called them, as I was entirely ignorant on the subject of cars, and couldn't have identified the make of it if I had been asked, and I couldn't see the faces of the occupants. I was also worried that my parents would restrict my already extremely limited freedoms if they knew that I had been in danger. I feel horrible for having never told anyone, and honestly hope that my secrecy hasn't led to someone being hurt. I believe the only missing people aside from runaway children or elderly adults with dementia in the city right now, though, are men, aside from one woman a few decades ago. Whoever followed and tried to trap a 16-year-old with flowers at a doctor's office. What's wrong with you? This happened when I was 5 and my best friend was 6. A quick layout of our school. The building was L-shaped and the short end was not in use at the moment, and cars could stop to the right of the L, in full view or behind the short part, mostly obscured. The road was pretty much in a square around the school, but only in the aforementioned places cars could pull over. We were at school one day and she did something that had made me angry. She grabbed my colored pens without asking. I wanted revenge. Shortly afterwards, recess had started, and about halfway through, I saw my best friend walking towards the back of the short building, and I followed her thinking that she was going to do something fun. When I rounded the corner, I saw a man in a car giving her candy through the open passenger door. Well, trying to. My childish mind thought, why doesn't that guy just step out to give the candy? Now he's holding it just outside her reach and she has to climb into the car to grab it, and his seat will get all dirty. My friend had one knee on the car seat, reaching for the candy now. I suddenly realized that this was the perfect time for my revenge. I would stop her from getting candy from this man. So I yelled at her that she wasn't allowed to be this close to the road. We would get in heaps of trouble if we were caught near the road instead of on the playground, and that I would tell on her. This caused her to jolt back, and she ran away from the car, back to the school playground, taunting me with the fact that a passerby thought she was so pretty that he wanted to give her candy but not to me. Apparently a teacher saw me walk towards the road and was on her way to fetch me. So she was just around the corner from us when my friend started taunting me. She heard what was said and quickly ran the last few steps towards us, frantically asking us, "Did anyone get in the car? Did you see any classmates get into the car?" She was clearly panicking and the car was long gone by now, having driven off when I yelled at my friend. My friend answered, "No, the nice man just wanted to give me candy, but she said that she would tell me, so we ran back. I really wanted that candy. Are we in trouble now?" The teacher escorted us inside, had all the other teachers count heads. Everyone was there, and talked to the police that were called. Neither me nor my friend knew what was wrong at that time, until their parents came to fetch her and gave her a stern talking to about accepting candy from strangers, saying things like, "We've talked about this, and we have plenty of candy back home." My mom was proud of me because she thought that I had listened to the stranger danger talks and protected my friend. I didn't correct her. A few years ago, my best friend and I were talking about our old school, and this day came up. We both just realized that if I hadn't been so obsessed with those colorful pens, or if she had asked before taking them, that she could have been taken and suffered a pretty bad fate. She couldn't believe how stupid she was for thinking that a random guy would really offer candy to kids from his car, especially since her parents had warned her about strangers before. I just felt embarrassed for not recognizing the situation from the talks that my parents gave me, and being so focused on getting revenge. It took me a while longer to fully realize what could have happened to her. I don't know if the guy was ever arrested or did anything else, and after this incident, my school started permanently posting a teacher as a lookout near the road, As far as I know, there were no more incidents at that school, and it was never really spoken of again. The official reason for the lookout teacher was to prevent students from running out onto the road and getting run over. When I drove past last year, they had put a fence all around the school. I'm guessing it's because they finally realized a fence is cheaper than paying a teacher an hour a day to just stand around. So, when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds. I was at a park down the street from my house, waiting for the school bus. Usually, my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating. Well, there was usually a few of us girls that were waiting there, but this day, I was the only one. So, I sat at the bench and had one headphone in, and one out so I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me. As I waited, a black Honda pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious that I was watching it, because I didn't want to look crazy. But after a few minutes, 2 big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and that these guys were creeping me out. Of course, he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text to my cousin who was home. I lived with my aunt and 2 guy cousins, unwinding down from the night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus it was 2 men. I didn't get any responses. When they got out of the car, they started to walk towards me. So I got up from the bench and I walked towards the street, because the bus was supposed to be there any minute. The driver actually ended up being a little bit late. As I stood there by the street, these men walked up to me and I could feel their bad energy. One guy said hello as the other stood there staring me down. I just gave them a small smile and a nod, and then I looked away. And then the same guy, I'll call him number 1, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number 2, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. And then number 1 kept asking me yes or no questions, like, do you have a boyfriend? And do you live close? Do you do drugs? We have some, do you want some? And then number 2 asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body, and I got the chills. Number 2, who was quiet the whole time, started to tell me that they just got back from Russia, but the way that he said it was so scary, almost intimidating. I knew they were from somewhere else because they had strong accents, but I couldn't pinpoint the place. They kept telling me to go to their car because they had drugs. I said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I wasn't stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. And then number 1 came up to me and asked if I had a car. I said no and that my bus is almost here. Sorry, I gotta go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they had asked me questions. But before the bus got to me, number 1 handed me a card and said he has a car shop and to call him if I ever need anything. He even stated that he would give me a free car. The card looked shifty and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew that I needed that number on it to report it. And so I took it, and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and it picked me up. As soon as I got on, I started to cry. I had a complete meltdown. It was like all of the adrenaline was keeping my mind and body aware and focused, while the men were there. But as soon as I was safe, my body and mind gave out. Thankfully, there weren't many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off, and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said that she saw them around me, but thought that I knew them because they were so close to my person. The driver called into her dispatch saying that there is an incident, so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick up all of the other students, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office. I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did campus security. They were so sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, their car, and the questions the creeps had asked me. I cried the whole time. And then I pulled out the card the guy gave me and I handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said he was going to call them and act like my dad. And so he did. It was on speakerphone and number 1 answered. I knew his voice as if it was burned into my brain. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack. The principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price, and the guy played dumb. The principal said that his daughter, me, gave him the card. As soon as he said that, the guy hung up. They tried calling again and the phone was shut off. Then eventually, it disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and the security as soon as the phone had clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police, and they had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew it was real, like my crazy story wasn't made up. The principal excused himself and the security guard, and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything that they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come get her. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in, and they asked me for the story again, and in front of the principal and security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me it sounded like they were watching us girls at the park because they chose the one day that one of us were alone. He also said the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they had wanted. I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that picked up first was my boyfriend. One of the officers talked to him, as the other finally got a hold of my aunt. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, aunt, mom, and cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears and the men were livid, but worried for me. A week later, some girl at another local high school not far from the park was saved by other students. She was being dragged into a black Honda by 2 guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of the car. The principal called me into his office, and that's how I found out. They also had the same officers there and had me choose the 2 guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out so fast, they were caught. It was in fact those 2 guys that tried grabbing the girl, a freshman girl. I felt worried for her instead, that she went through worse than I did, and I felt almost free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulder as often. I couldn't believe they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, now ex-boyfriend, also took me some days. I'm thankful to be alive and well, and I'm even more thankful that that girl was also saved by the courageous kids at our high school.